Welcome to the Einstein Forum. The last 27 minutes have increased my skepticism about the digital medium. On the other hand, it has allowed us to host someone like Jane Goodall. I want to extend my thanks to Sham Wupaluri, our 2020 Einstein Fellow, who unfortunately is in lockdown in Mumbai, so he'll actually be joining us next year. The Einstein Forum is called the Einstein Forum because we are the caretakers of the only cottage or house that Einstein ever had built. And when we took over the care of the cottage, we sat around our wonderful board of advisors and tried to think, what could we do with it that would make Einstein's ghost happy? And the answer was, we should use it to pick one young thinker a year from any country and any field, put them there, and reward them for doing something that they hadn't done before, instead of further specializing, which is, of course, they usually get punished for. So Sham is our fellow this year. He has brought us Dr. Goodall. I would have said Jane Goodall needs no introduction, but that isn't true. Probably everyone, or most literate people, know about her path-breaking work, living alone in the wild, the first person to do so, and to do long-term studies of chimpanzees, which not only shed an enormous light on chimpanzees, but also on human animals. But what you may not know is what else Jane Goodall has done. She's a founder of the Jane Goodall Institute, which has branches in 23 countries. She's a United Nations messenger of peace for her work in conservation. She's redefined species conservation to include and involve local people and their environments. The Goodall Institute support 2 sanctuaries for orphan chimpanzees, and various humanitarian programs which empower, I have this from the website, young people of all ages, which I like very much as a formulation, empowering young people of all ages to be involved in hands-on projects for their community, animals, and the environment in more than 65 countries. When Sham arranged this conversation, he asked me to moderate it, and I said, no, Sham, there's somebody better, and it's Wendy Doniger. For a number of reasons, one of which being that among her 43 books, several of them are about animals, the various animals which she has lived with and thought about and written about most of her life. When Wendy retired from teaching at the University of Chicago, she also officially retired from the board of advisors of the Einstein Forum. But as you see, Wendy, we don't let you go so easily. Once part of the Einstein Forum, always a part of the Einstein Forum. So take it away. Wendy and Jane will speak for about 40 minutes, after which there is a Q&A function at the bottom of hopefully most of your screens, and you may ask whatever you like, and I will read out your questions. Go for it.
Well, thank you, Susan, and thank you, Jane. It's such an honor and a wonderful opportunity to be able to talk to someone I've been reading and admiring for so long. So I have a couple of areas of questions. So the first question is about gender. I know that when you began, you once said you wanted to do things that women weren't allowed to do, like going to Africa. And there was resistance against many of the things you tried to do. You had to bring your mother with you. She was a wonderful woman and she came, and so forth. And so in many ways that the press called you a comely miss and so forth. So there were ways in which your gender seemed to work against you. But then, of course, you were a comely miss. You were a very attractive young woman, and you got a lot of press coverage for that. I always wondered, you're always photographed and filmed wearing shorts in Africa, climbing trees and going through scratchy landscape. And I wondered how you did that and whether it was because you had very lovely legs and that was part of the what you call geographic cheesecake. So my question to you is, how did your gender work against you and for you in those early years when you were a beautiful young woman alone in Africa? And how did it change over the years as you became famous and older?
Okay, well, let me for a second go back to a bit earlier. So I was born loving animals. And when I was growing up, we were at war. Our countries were at war. And anyway, television hadn't been invented. My family had very little money. My father was away in the army, building bridges in Asia. And so I read books. I read books and I was outside in nature. And the books I read were all about animals. They came from the library because we couldn't afford new books. And I read Dr. Dolittle, which I know is in German. And I also I found this little book, Tarzan of the Apes. So when I was 10 years old, I decided I will grow up, go to Africa, live with wild animals and write books about them.
And Tarzan's girlfriend was named Jane. Tarzan's girlfriend was named Jane. I wondered whether that had any role in your life.
No, because I thought that Jane was a wimp and Tarzan married the wrong Jane. But, I knew there wasn't a Tarzan. It's just that it was the animals, the animals, the animals. And people laughed at me because we didn't have money. Africa was far away and girls didn't do that sort of thing. But my mother, and I bring this in because this is a very important part of everything. She said, if you really want to do something like this, you're going to have to work terribly hard, take advantage of every opportunity. And if you don't give up, maybe you find a way. And I wish she was alive to know how many people have said to me or written to me, I want to thank you because you taught me that because you did it, I can do it too. And that's boys as well as girls in disadvantaged communities. But anyway, there was no money for university. I had to get a job. We didn't have money, so there was just enough money for a boring secretarial course. And then I got this opportunity, a letter from a school friend inviting me to Kenya. So I worked as a waitress to earn enough money for the fare. It was by boat in those days, took a month. And that's where I heard about Dr. Louis Leakey, the famous paleontologist, anthropologist. And I went to see him because somebody said, if you're interested in animals, you should meet Louis. And I think he was impressed how much I knew about the animals, even though I'd only just arrived, because I'd read everything I possibly could, and there wasn't much. And he took me on as his assistant. And then he asked if I would be prepared to go and try and study chimps. Well, I mean, I would have studied anything to be out in the bush. Chimpanzees, wow. So it took him a year to get the money, because who was give money for this young girl? And then the British authorities, because back then it was still Tanganyikan, it was old German East Africa, now under control of the Brits. And they said, no, we won't take responsibility for a young girl on her own. And so Mum volunteered to come. That's why I had her. It wasn't that I had to go with Mummy,
No, but it was you had her.
So anyway, it's pretty amazing. She came, and so the disadvantage of being a woman actually never happened at that stage because my family were just so supportive. The advantage was that Louis Leakey felt that women might be better observers, be more patient, which I think was probably true because in those days it was expected the man would be the breadwinner and he would have to get his PhD quickly in order to support a family. And, I had no expectation of anything like that. I didn't want to be a scientist. So the other advantage I had was this was just after independence. And so the African men were a bit resentful of white males. You can imagine they'd been under colonial rule for so long. But a white girl, this small, innocent-seeming white girl with her mummy, with her mother, they wanted to help, and so it was a big advantage. And then when the first article appeared with the Geographic and the documentaries, and all these scientists were snootily saying, well, why should we believe her? She's just a woman and she's only just got out there and she hasn't got a degree. And anyway, she's only got some fame because of her legs, which is what you mentioned. And at the time, I didn't care. All I wanted was to be able to go on studying the chimps. And if my legs helped me, well, good for them. I mean, you know, my genes gave me nice legs. When I look at the recent film Jane, I agree, they were pretty nice.
They were.
May I say that is a wonderful film for those who are listening. You can just click it on Netflix. It has original footage, 60 years old, and it's just a fascinating view of exactly how Jane Goodall began her work in the wild.
It's wonderful to see you as a young girl, so happy there and so patient. And then I thought about your mother and how wonderful and how supportive she was of you. And then I was so interested when you wrote about the chimp Flo and what a good mother she was. And at one point you said that when you were beginning to raise your own son in Africa, you modeled some aspects of your behavior on that of this mother chimp Flo, the fact that she kept her babies with her all the time and so forth, and that you felt that she was a good model of a mother. And did you continue with that? Was it just the baby, or was the chimp? Did Flo really help you to be the good mother that you were throughout your motherhood?
I don't know what role Flo played. I mean, I think I modeled my maternal skills first of all on my own upbringing. But also, you know, at that time, Dr. Spock, do you remember Dr. Spock?
Oh, Dr. Spock.
Famous. All these books about child raising, and some of his points were really good. And then there was Flo. Well, in chimp society, it turns out there's good mothers and less good mothers. And the good mothers are just like my mother. They support their offspring, and they'll run in to defend them, even if they know they're going to get beaten up themselves. And that's how Flo was. She was fearless in defense of her young ones. And now we can look back over 60 years of research at Gombe, and we find that the offspring of the supportive mothers tend to do better. The males reach a higher place in the hierarchy, tend to have more offspring, and the females are better mothers. So what I took from Flo that was very important for me, one, Flo and the other mothers, very important for the infant chimp to be surrounded with 2 or 3 adults upon whom the child can rely, always there, you know, giving security. And I think that's just as important for human children. I also loved the way that the mothers play with their offspring. They have such fun with them. They enjoy them. They tickle them. They chase them. And I thought, I'm going to have fun with my baby too. And I did. And people said to me, because, you know, I had him in, I was sleeping with him, you can't have him in your bed. And I said, why not? Well, you'll squash him. I said, no, why should I squash him? I mean, you know, people don't squash their babies. You have an instinct about that, I think. And then because I was with him all the time, they said, oh, he's going to be a very clinging, dependent child. Well, he was the opposite because he had that early security. So I feel quite strongly about that. And, you know, one last thing I'll say on this is that the first people who were interested in my research were not the ethologists. I don't think they liked what I was doing. It was all wrong, according to them. It was the child psychologists, Renee Spitz and John Bowlby. They were the ones. And the first person who invited me to Japan, where the Japanese monkey study had been going, wasn't a Japanese primatologist. It was what was his name? Well, whatever his name was, he was a child psychologist.
Mm.
So it's fascinating, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, in the days in which you grew up in England, people wheeled their babies around in these elaborate prams. They were like little Rolls Royces. And nowadays, women carry their babies in special little things on their stomachs and on their backs.
Yeah.
So you were ahead of your time in the idea of having the baby in contact with your body, as opposed to in some big Cadillac of a carriage. So I wonder whether you were part of starting that trend of carrying the children on your body, which even when I raised my son, even in the 70s, people were still using prams and so forth.
Oh, they're still using prams now. Every day on my walks, I see people with prams. So
in America, you see them carrying them on their backs like chimps.
Yes, that's getting more common, but I don't think I started that. I don't know. Who knows? I don't know, because I didn't go around carrying grub in a backpack or on my tummy. I carried in my arms.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have those carry things for babies when I had him.
That you carried him. I'd like to ask you also about language. I'm interested in language as a linguist, and I was so interested in what you wrote in your autobiography. First of all, you said that when you were young, you had trouble learning languages, and also that you suffered at times in your life from prosopagnosia, from a difficulty in recognizing the faces of people. Oliver Sacks has written about that too. And yet, you were the one who began the idea that you could understand the language of chimps, and you did, and you wrote a great deal about learning their language, and also by naming them all, Flo and Fifi and Freud and so forth, you obviously recognized all of them as individuals. And I remembered years ago, a friend of mine was talking to Konrad Lorenz, someone whom you also admired, and he said he suffered from prosopagnosia, from a difficulty in understanding faces, but he could identify every single one of his 438 gray-lag geese.
Yes, I know.
So I always loved that. So then I wonder whether what was the difference that you regarded yourself not as a talented linguist in human languages, and yet you were a great linguist when it came to animals, and also recognizing their faces. What was the difference in those two linguistic areas?
Well, it's very, very different, because I don't have any difficulty in recognizing human, what we call body language, which is exactly the same as the chimps: kissing, embracing, holding hands, patting one another, crouching, like bowing to the ground, standing up, swaggering, raising a fist, begging for food with outstretched palm. Those are exactly the same. And then the chimpanzees' calls, they're not like human language. They're not. I still don't know human language. So, the chimps make different sounds, which I named, and everybody's followed those names since. And, they're more like the sound, like we laugh and we grunt and we scream, so do the chimps. They make a sort of wah when they're angry, which is a little bit like human shout. So there's an awful lot that's the same, which doesn't really relate to our language. And it's interesting, because when it comes to English, I think, my English, my language, my writing, my speaking is just about perfect, but it's foreign languages. And that does tie in, according to Oliver Sacks, because he's the one who told me I had this face blindness. I thought it was just me. It was very embarrassing. Now I know it's many other people have it, but it's not extreme. So if I'm with somebody for a few days, I always know them. And it was the same with the chimps. It just took me longer. I had to get to know them for longer time to identify them as individuals.
That also relates to the fact that you gave them such wonderful names, Flo and Fifi and Freud and Frodo. And I wondered whether you named them only as you got to know them as individuals, and whether before that, were they just Chimp 1 and Chimp 2? And how did the naming come into it?
Well, I've always named my animals. I kept snails as a child. We used to raise them. and they all had names, and everything I ever had had a name. And when I finally got to Cambridge to do my PhD and was told I should have numbered the chimps, I looked at them in amazement. They also told me I couldn't talk about personality, mind, or emotion because those were unique to us. But anyway, I named the chimps as I got to know them. And before that, I couldn't call them chimp 1, chimp 2 until I knew them. So when I knew them, I gave them a name, not a number. And before I gave them names, before I knew them, I just said a male chimpanzee or a female chimpanzee or something like that. So naming just came automatically to me,
But they're related. The family names with Frodo and F and so forth. So they follow lineages.
Yes, and right at the beginning, no. And of course, right at the beginning, I had no idea that I'd be staying in Gombe that long. I mean, the longest study at that time was 1 year. And that was George Schaller with the mountain gorillas and the Japanese macaques. But in Europe, we didn't know about those studies. And so after a bit, as one got to know the different individuals and families and everything, we realized that to have every family member starting with the same letter would be helpful for people to, quickly know the relationships. So there's the famous F family, there's the famous G family, and so on.
And one they named Freud because he was interested in sex. I always like that.
Well, all the male infants are, all of them. There's not one single male I've ever met who wasn't. I mean, they're incredibly sexy as infants. They really are.
More than the females. The males are clearly more interested in sex than the females, even as babies.
It differs. Now, Fifi I thought she was the equivalent of a nymphomaniac, Flo's daughter Fifi. She couldn't get enough of it. And when chimpanzees are receptive, they get this pink swelling. And I still can't imagine what that's for, but anyway, they do. And so Fifi was so delighted when the males mated with her. And when her pink swelling shriveled, she couldn't understand it. And one male she knocked over backwards, pushing into him. But other females are terrified. And I think the difference here is Fifi had 2 older brothers. So she wasn't afraid of males. She knew all about them. And the male courtship display is aggressive. The hair bristles, he stands upright, he swaggers from foot to foot, he sways a branch. And so the females who aren't so familiar with how males behave, haven't rough and tumbled so much with males, they're terrified and they run away. And then they get beaten up.
In your autobiographical writings, you write, and you said even now how you loved animals as a child, and I was delighted to see you rode horses as a young girl and always had dogs. So you had various animal relationships before the relationships you had with the chimpanzees in Gombe. So I wondered whether there was a kind of a general feeling you had for a general way of approaching animals and talking with them, or whether it was really species specific, that the things that you learned from your life with dogs and horses as a young girl did or did not help you transfer, prepare you for devising your ways of living with this other species of chimpanzees. Is there a way that animals in general are something you can respond to, or did you have to learn differently each time?
No, I think it's animals in general. I mean, it's just one basic rule, really, that you don't make sudden movements, you don't make sudden loud noises, you're very, very patient. And I'm sure you know the story of how I hid in a hen house for 4 hours when I was 4 years old because I couldn't think where the egg came out of the hen. I kept asking people, but where's the hole? Where does the egg come out? So nobody told me, so I hid in the hen house. And so
you knew to hide. You knew not to go into the hen house. You knew that you needed, as a young child, you had to wait for hours that the hen would come in. How did you figure that out at such a young
age? Because it started with me seeing a hen go into the hen house and thinking, she's going to lay an egg, because that's the only reason they went in the daytime. And I crawled after her and she flew out. So that's when it dawned in my little 4-year-old mind, no hen will lay an egg here now. This is a dangerous place. So that's when I went into the empty hen house and waited. And my mother had no idea where I was. She'd taken me for a holiday onto this farm. And she even rang up the police because it was getting towards dark. And yet, when she saw me running towards the house, you know, many mothers would have grabbed that child and reprimanded them. Don't you dare go off without telling us again. But she sat down and listened to the wonderful story of how a hen lays an egg.
You had a wonderful mother. There's no question about it.
Yes.
She sounds like a great woman. And I loved
She
reading about
was.
your mother.
You know, and one other thing I have to say, since I'm talking to you there in Germany, just after the war, you can imagine, I'm sure it was the same in Germany, but, you know, we were being bombed and people were dying and that sort of thing. So when we heard a German voice, it was like a sort of instinctive fear. And my uncle was out there in part of Germany, and he found a family who wanted somebody to teach their children English. And this is literally just 2 years after the war. And Mum let me go because she said, I want you to understand that Nazis and Hitler are nothing to do with the average German. And so I want you to go and see that Germans are the same as us. That's how wise she was.
Wow.
A great woman, a wonderful woman. That's really wonderful. It's a wonderful story.
Yep.
Let me ask you about some of the darker sides of your work as well. And first of all, about your work with animals in general, that in your recent years you've been crusading for, not just for chimpanzees. I loved a sentence that you wrote once. You said, we should think twice before we squash a fly. And that reminded me of something that might be said by a Buddhist or even by a Jain. It's an extreme reverence for animal life. Do you feel that way about all animals? And have you been influenced in your, not so much your love of animals, which you obviously had as a young child, but in your crusading for justice and mercy for animals? Have you been influenced by Buddhism and Jainism?
I don't think I've been influenced by it, but I immediately, you know, I just related. I relate to Buddhism and Jainism and Baha'i and all the rest of it. In fact, I'm part of the interfaith group, and there's I've been involved in various conferences with the different faiths and their attitude towards animals. So, but you know, I have always felt the same about animals, that they have personalities, minds, and emotions. My dog taught me. And, you know, I was lucky because chimpanzees are biologically so like us, you know, sharing 98.6% of composition of DNA, for example. Because of that, and Hugo's film, Geographic sent Hugo out to make the film, and the descriptions that I was providing of chimp behavior, that I think is responsible for causing the ethologists to come out of that reductionist box, which said that we humans, I mean, I was actually taught at Cambridge, or not taught, but told, the difference between us and other animals was one of kind. Not degree, kind. We were separated from all the other animals by an unbridgeable chasm.
Despite Darwin had made no dent in that view in Cambridge?
No, he didn't. And, you know, I think it was religion creeping in here, because there's the mistranslation of the word that's translated in the Bible as dominion. And my Jewish scholar friends tell me the original word didn't mean dominion, doesn't translate as dominion, but something closer to stewardship. That's very different from dominion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, animals aren't here for us to use. And the fact that people have used animals as unthinking, unfeeling non-sentient beings has led to so much cruelty and suffering. And actually, it's actually caused this terrible pandemic that's disrupted the entire world. Our disrespect of animals, killing them, butchering them, trafficking them, selling them in these terrible conditions in the wildlife meat markets in China, our intensive farming, crowding animals together in these very cruel, they've been called concentration camps for animals. And it's created environments which make it easy for the virus or a bacteria to jump from an animal to a person, the spillover effect. That's how we've got this pandemic among us.
I wonder whether at the same time as you've written so well about our cruelty to animals, and you've been crusading for years against it, yet in your writings and in your films, you have not held back from showing the cruelties of the animals themselves, the darker side of the chimps, the way that some of them have cannibalized their own young, the way that there was a splinter group which was really wiped out by the group as a whole, their fierceness in the films. In addition to all your many other qualities, your courage to me seemed extraordinary when you film very, very angry and very, very dangerous animals when they became angry. So you haven't shied away from that, the idea that that man is the only predator. The animals are predators too, and they have their dark side. How do you work that into your non-theological animal theology?
Well, because the chimpanzees are so like us in that they have this dark side. They're so like us in that they have this compassionate and altruistic side. And I think humans are further along in moral evolution, so we can actually question right and wrong. And so once you realize, I mean, we all know it's wrong to torture human beings. The fact that people do it is this dark side, which seems to probably have been inherited from a common ancestor all those years ago. 6 million years ago. But because the biggest difference is the development of our intellect. So chimps and other animals are way, way, way more intelligent than people used to credit them with. I mean, chimpanzees can learn over 400 signs of American Sign Language, for example, and work computers, and pigs can paint, But we sent a rocket to Mars. A little robot's been taking photos. We see the surface of the red planet, where at one time it was thought human life might survive. We know now it can't. So we've got this one planet. So how is the most intellectual species destroying its only home? And it seems to me there's a disconnect between head and heart. So chimps and humans both have the dark side, but we are able to question our motives, question our behavior, teach children what's right and what's wrong. And in chimp society, really, might is right.
So there is some advance, at least.
Yes, we know. I mean, think of all the amazing, incredible human beings on this planet, and then there are the bad ones, and there's the wars, and there's domestic violence, and the big difference between chimpanzee brutal behavior and human brutal behavior is a chimp will get an emotion of anger and act out of that emotion of anger or fear or whatever it is. And they are totally incapable of sitting and planning in cold blood to torture someone who isn't even there. And that's what I call evil, which I don't think the chimps are capable of.
And so much of your crusading nowadays is trying to make human beings more conscious of the damage that they're doing, not only to the animals that they torture in all sorts of ways, sometimes for medical reasons. And I appreciate your ambivalence on that point, that there are ways of doing it and ways of not doing it. but also just to save the environment in which animals live, to stop from cutting down the trees and so forth. So do you think that there's a possibility with this plague that we're living with now, and the possibility of nuclear war and all sorts of ways in which humans, as you know, may even destroy their life on this planet? Do you think there's a time when we will be gone and the animals will take over as they did before we took over them?
Well, if we don't change our ways now, and after this pandemic is the time when people are beginning to question our relationship with nature, with the natural world. If we don't, we come out of the pandemic, we're still confronted with an even worse, more existential crisis, which is climate crisis. And if we don't address that, and so far governments mostly haven't, not strongly enough, then it won't be just us that disappears off the planet. It'll be just about everything. And already we're losing so many species. The extinction rate is horrendous, animals and plants. But I just have to pick up on one thing you said, this thing about animals being used in experimentation.
Yes.
The most important thing here, and there's many groups now of doctors and other scientists who form groups to push the alternatives to the use of any live animals. Because if we take chimps, the closest to us genetically and in similarities and composition of blood and immune system and so on, they could be infected with HIV/AIDS, the HIV virus, but they don't get the symptoms like we do. So even chimps so like us. And when they were using chimps for polio experimentation, a cure that actually saved hundreds and thousands of people didn't work on chimps and was therefore withheld for a couple of years. And this is the same with, are we justified in genetically modifying a mouse to grow a tumor as big as itself? And there's a lot of experimentation done now to show that rats and mice, as well as pigs and chimpanzees, feel pain the same way as we do. It affects the same part of the brain.
Without wanting to interrupt the two of you, I just want to tell everyone who's listening, you are welcome to type questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will be happy to read them out to Jane Goodall.
I'd like to ask one last question on a slightly lighter, brighter note before I hand over the question to the audience. I was touched by the way that you were inspired, as you told us, by Tarzan and by Dr. Dolittle, which are actually, of course, works of fiction rather than works of science, but they inspired you to become a great scientist. And I wonder whether in all the fan mail that you get over the years, whether your works of science and of autobiography are taking the place of my generation's use of Dr. Dolittle. Are you the new person that people want to grow up and be like and change their lives in order to follow in your work? Do you get that kind of fan mail, I hope and believe?
Oh, I can't begin to tell you how much. I mean,
good.
People tell me that it's changed their life, it's changed the way they think about animals. Children say, I want to be like you, and that starts at age 5 and goes right through the university. I meet them in every country. I've been lecturing 300 days a year, traveling on the road to all over. So, with this youth program that we have, Roots and Shoots, which has young people of all ages, which is now in 65 countries and growing. But because it began in 91, we have hundreds and thousands of people who've been through the program at school and college. And somehow they retain the values that they learned. And I think they get values partly because we let them choose their projects so that they work on what they're passionate about. and then share what they've done with the other members of the group. And between them, the group must choose a project to help people, to help animals, to help the environment. But also bringing people together, mostly virtually, but face-to-face when we can, from different countries. They're beginning to understand that far more important than the color of the skin, the culture, the religion, and so on, is the fact that we are actually all human beings. And they retain the values that they learned about the environment, and we're increasingly seeing children grow up separated from nature, which is a disaster. But, you know, I go to China, I've been going there since mid-90s. The number of adults who come up and say, well, I care about the environment, I care about animals because I was in Roots and Shoots in primary school. So this effect now is everywhere. And the passion of my life is growing. Roots and Shoots, it's growing in Germany. You know, we've got an institute in Germany, JGI in Germany.
Well, that's very hopeful, and I'm very grateful to you for it. Thank you. Thank you.
I now have 5 interesting questions. Let me begin with Charlotte Wiltshire. What advice do you have for an aspiring primatologist?
Well, my advice would be, first of all, you've really, really got to be passionate about it because there's a lot of competition. Partly my fault, I'm sure. Me and Diane Fossey and Biru David. So you've got to be prepared to work hard. You'd probably be best in a gap year to volunteer with one of the animal sanctuaries from various parts of the world, just to make sure that you really want to do this. And then there's going to be a lot of hard work, like my mother told me. And, you know, I was lucky I didn't need the degree when I went out there, but I did need it in the end. And these days, there's more competition and you need a good degree to get the sort of job you may want. But on the other hand, some people just want to go and do conservation work with primates.
This is a related question from Thalia Gigerenzer. Hello, Thalia. What life advice do you have for young people today?
The most important for everybody, not just young, is to remember every day you live, you make an impact on the planet. And you can choose what sort of impact you make. And I mentioned earlier these horrible intensive factory farms. So can you do anything about that? Yes, you can make choices based on how does this product that I'm buying or eating or wearing, how was it made? Did it harm the environment? Did it harm animals? Is it cheap because of child slave labor or inappropriate payment to the people who've made it? And when it comes to eating a lot of meat, it's not just the cruelty of the factory farms, it's the horrendous impact on the environment, clearing areas to grow the grain, fossil fuel to get the grain to the animal to the abattoir, the meat to the table, water getting increasingly scarce in drought areas, and changing vegetable to animal protein takes a lot of water. And finally, in all these billions and billions of suffering animals produce methane gas in their digestion, like we do. And the animal agriculture amount of methane is very, very considerable in the so-called greenhouse gases that are leading to climate change.
So here's a related question from an anonymous attendee. Ms. Goodall, would you call the vegan extremist call to fully eliminate animal dependency justified? What about the human cultures and habits dependent on animal use or consumption?
Well, it's partly, first of all, we must get rid of the factory farms. That's one thing, which means people are going to have to eat much less meat. I'm vegan when I'm at home. And if you look up how dairy cows are treated in these factory farms, if you look up the way chickens are treated, you don't want to drink milk anymore, and you don't want milk products, and you don't want eggs. So there's a big difference between the way animals in these cultures are typically kept. at least they have a fairly decent life out grazing and rootling in the ground. And in some areas, they have to eat meat because there's so little vegetation in these arid areas. The animals can change dry grass into something humans can eat and drink, which we can't.
Here is a question from Björn Freder. If it's the Björn Freder I know in Tennessee, hello. What is the most surprising behavior you've observed in chimpanzees?
Well, I suppose the most surprising in a horrible way was the fact that there's cannibalism and warfare. Those totally surprised me when I first saw them. But on the other side, I think, well, what's fascinated me is the relationship between mothers and young and between the siblings and how they help each other, how they learn by imitating, all the different tools they use, and sometimes seeing how a chance experience can lead to a chimpanzee using a tool in a new way for the first time. And there's some wonderful examples of that. One of them, Mike, when we were feeding bananas in the early days, and he hadn't really got completely trusting of me. And I held this banana out in my hand, and he didn't like that. He wanted me to throw it to him. And he was angry, so he sat there and he shook a little bunch of grasses because they shake when they're angry. They shake vegetation. And one of those grasses, long, thin, slender grass, touched the banana. And just simply, it was like an aha moment. He stopped shaking the grasses, looked around, reached out for a long stick and hit the banana from my hand. And that was all in one swift movement from seeing that grass touch the banana to realizing, well, that's not going to work, but it was wonderful.
So here's a follow-up question from someone who wants to remain anonymous. So do you mean that chimps don't have morals and they just don't do evil?
Well, they don't do, as I defined evil, evil means sitting, planning in cold blood to harm somebody. Chimpanzees are brutal because they're responding to an emotion of the moment. We do that too. I mean, that's the cause of domestic violence for the most part. Somebody loses their temper, maybe they're drunk, and they hit. And that's the same kind of thing that the chimps do, although they don't get drunk. Captive ones like alcohol, by the way. And because you're a linguist, I think personally that the development of our intellect, this extraordinary intellect we have, comes from the fact that we hit upon this way of communicating with words. So, I can tell people things that they've never heard about and they can understand because I draw pictures with words. We can teach children about things that are not present. We can plan for the distant future. We can bring people together to have discussions, people from different walks of life and different, careers to try and solve problems.
Here are two anonymous but related questions. How was it like to join the chimpanzees for the first time? Were you scared? And when was the last time you saw your chimpanzees, and how do you stay in touch with or remember your chimpanzees today?
Well, first of all, 4 months to any of them. And then it was David Greybeard, and it was David Greybeard I first saw using and making tools, which was the big breakthrough, because that enabled Leakey to bring in the geographic. Because at that time it was thought that humans and only humans used and made tools. So that, of course, was when the scientists said, why should they believe me? Because I didn't have a degree and I was a girl. But then Hugo's film convinced them. What we were asking? Was I frightened?
Yes.
There were, right at the beginning, when they lost their fear, for a little while, for maybe about 2 months, they treated me as a predator. And, you know, they are like 8, 10 times stronger than me. And when they stand upright and they bristle their hair and they sway branches, they are scary. But fortunately, while this was going on, I wasn't frightened. It was only after they'd given up and gone away that my legs were a bit trembly. So no, I wasn't frightened of them. And I always felt I was meant to be there and that I wouldn't actually get hurt. So what I was frightened of was leopards. And, but again, I thought, well, they're not going to hurt me because I'm meant to be here. And they didn't. So that was something. Last time I've been going to Gombe, although I left to do this advocacy in 1986, I've been going back twice a year to Gombe just for a few days. And I don't always see the chimp, especially now, because sometimes they're very high in the mountains. And I am 86, so, you know, it's a bit silly to climb up to the tops of the mountains like when I was young. But I keep up to date because we've got a wonderful team of researchers there. And they send me news and photographs and babies born and chimps getting sick and the competition between the alpha males, which, by the way, is that they stand up, they swagger, they make furious faces, they shake their fists. They're just like some human male politicians. They really are. And I won't name any names there, but I think you know what I mean.
You know who you mean.
What I mean. So, and this next week, the 14th of July, and you can check it out on our website, janegoodall.org, it's the 60th anniversary of the day I first arrived in Gombe. So there'll be lots of stuff coming out on the website. We're collecting up stories from over the years. There'll be a lot of information about the 60 years of research coming out, the different papers that are being published, the different students who've got their PhDs there, changed their career because they came to visit Gombe, even sometimes as tourists. So I'm very much in touch with what's going on there. Until now, this pandemic, in 60 years, this is the first time we've had to virtually stop the daily follows because chimps can surely catch this pandemic. They're very susceptible to respiratory diseases.
We've kept you for quite a while, in addition to making you fiddle with the technology. There are a number of questions. There are a couple of really good ones. Might I ask you just a couple more?
Yes, and then you can always send questions. You know, you've got Mary Lewis's email. You can send them there.
Thank you very much. Here is one from Silke Zeller. She says, I work as a psychologist on quantitative studies about animal abuse by private persons. So far, we've asked 3,000 people and not one single person has done nothing towards an animal, even if we don't consider killing insects statistical. What is your view about that kind of daily animal abuse by private people?
Well, unfortunately, some people still say they believe that animals don't have feelings, and it's very different from abusing people. Some people are just ignorant. They treat their dogs badly. They don't mean to, but they don't understand what a dog needs. There's abuse that goes on all the time. And that's one of the things we're fighting to eliminate. And that's one of the 3 pillars of Roots and Shoots is learning to understand and treat animals well. So it's very much part of what the Jane Goodall Institute does, is try and sensitize people, because a lot of abuse, a lot of mistreatment is due to ignorance, definitely.
And here is a related question from Susanna Carr. Does connectedness to other living beings require more courage than many people are prepared to invest in relationships? Do you see change in regard to emotions and feelings about non-human animals?
Oh, definitely. There's been, during my life, there's been a huge change in people's attitude, not only to animals, but also to the environment and the way that we're harming it. And so Roots and Shoots is spreading that. And of course, we collaborate and partner with other youth organizations if they have the same values as we do. But I think we're the only youth organization that actually head-on tackles animals, people, and environment. All three have to be part of every group because everything in this life is interconnected. And I learned that in the rainforest, how every little species has a role to play. And it may seem insignificant, but maybe it's the major food source of another. So if it goes extinct, then that will affect another, and the ripple effect can lead to ecosystem collapse.
So here's a question by the philosopher Björn Freta. Would you agree that the speciest bias of humans toward non-human animals is parallel to the racist biases by humans towards other humans?
Yes, I was actually thinking about that today. I was thinking about slavery, and I think a lot of people are thinking about Black Lives Matter right now because of what's going on. And I was thinking, we talk about enslaving people, and actually what we're doing is enslaving animals. I was reading a horrific description of how in Thailand, where they're Buddhists and they shouldn't be harming animals. But they take baby elephants, they catch them from the wild, and they beat them for 3 months to break their spirit. I mean, it's absolutely horrible. And I was thinking, that's how we treated people. And a lot of animal rights people, I always say to them, well, don't forget, yes, we have to stop the abuse of animals, but we're abusing people too, all the time, every day. And the way to change, the last thing I'll say here, and then I really think we have to stop because my voice is going. But the last thing I'll say is, if you want to make a difference, if you meet somebody who's being cruel to animals, like when I first had to go into the medical research labs, which was one of the worst things I've ever had to do, and into the meat markets in Africa and China, if you start arguing with them and berating them and telling them they're cruel, bad people, they're not going to listen to you because they don't want to hear that. So the way I do it is telling stories, because you've got to reach the heart. It's no good battering at the head, especially if you're a female and you're trying to change the mind of a big dominant male, because they're not going to have their mind changed by you. But if you tell stories. So when I went into the labs, I showed them pictures of how the chimps behave at Gombe, how they laze about in the sun, how the young ones tumble and play, and the big males groom each other. And then compare that to a 5-foot, 5 by 5 foot cage, bleak with nothing in it, and alone. And it got to them because they hadn't thought of that before.
Jane, I promised Sham the last question, and since he arranged this conversation, might he be permitted to ask, and then we'll let you go and have a cup of tea and rest your voice?
Cup of tea? What about a glass of whiskey?
Yeah, I've opened a bottle of good wine to have after this conversation.
No, the wine doesn't help my voice. Whiskey, and I'm serious, you can look it up. Whiskey, yeah. Your tired voice, opera singers do it.
Seriously, thank you for the tip.
Yeah, it really works. I guess it could be another spirit, but it's a spirit.
Sham.
Yeah, it's mesmerizing to hear from you as ever. So I would like to ask something that might be interest to a lot of us, something that is not so widely known about you. But I need to quickly give you some context for that. A few years back, I was at a monastery sort of setting with a lot of Buddhist monks. And it was a kind of residential camp where we were given soaps and other basic amenities for us to live there. So while I was leaving, I was carefully packing the leftover piece of soap in my bag, and I was carrying it along with me. A very senior monk noticed that, and he told me, that's quite thoughtful because people generally throw these things away. And he ended this by saying that that's very much like Jane Goodall. And I was quite surprised that this sort of coincidence, because little did he know that I heavily admire you. So next half an hour we spent on discussing about you. And he told me that when you're in Malaysia, you used to eat the same thing for the whole week, the same type of breakfast all over the state. And when you travel, you carry the same soap. I mean, sometimes the ones that is given by the hotel, the complimentary soaps to different trips, and you don't throw them away. Now, you believe in using the resources to the fullest and wasting very little as much as possible. Now, that is so inspiring. And I would also like to say that apart from the large place that you own in our hearts, you have very little worldly possessions apart from your Mr. H stuffed toy, which we cannot unfortunately see because you're not there on the video, and a bottle of whiskey that you might have right now, and some coffee powder. So you do live like a sort of a monk, except for that whiskey part, a very simple and a beautiful life. Now the issue here is that this notion of simplicity has been sought after in all disciplines. I mean, physicists are trying to understand the universe and how it is built up by using the simple laws of the universe. Philosophers, especially in the East, like Taoists and Buddhists, consider simple living as virtue. Now your work, your life always have had this comforting simplicity to them. Can you tell us in your own words about the notion of simplicity? And I know that it's a very abstract topic, but we would really love to hear it from you. What you think in terms of your work, lifestyle, and thought. It would be an honor.
Okay, well, I certainly absolutely believe in what Mahatma Gandhi said, which is that the planet can provide for human need, but not human greed. And there are two things we have to tackle. One is to alleviate poverty, because if you're really poor, you're going to cut down the last trees in your desperate effort to grow food, which is why we work with the people in all the areas where we're doing conservation until they become our partners, help them find ways of living without destroying the environment. But the unsustainable lifestyle, which relates to your question, I mean, I have more than I need, but I do try. I do indeed. I take a piece of soap round a whole tour. And, you know, I try, like I'll save a roll from dinner and use it for my breakfast. I won't do expensive room service or pay lots of money for a breakfast, even if I have to stay in hotels, which I kind of do on these tours. And one person who was in my institute at one time, she was in the development section, and she said to Mary Lewis, who was traveling with me, "You've got to get Jane some new clothes." I was looking in the photographs and I saw she was wearing this dress 5 years ago. And so I don't buy new clothes until I literally have to when they wear out. And part of it, you know, was growing up in the war, because everything was rationed. I mean, we'd like have one square of chocolate in a week. And so I learned not to take anything for granted. And that's what's the problem with so many young people today. It's not their fault, but they just grow up and they expect life to give them all these things. They expect, then there's all the people living in poverty who have nothing. So I'm glad you brought this up. And I do indeed. I try very, very hard to use everything. I try not to use plastic. I try, when I do, wear my clothes until they wear out. And yeah, I really try to live as simply as possible.
Jane, it has been even lovelier to meet you than I thought it would be. And I thank you so much for your time. I hope one day we may meet in actual life, or at least be able to see each other.
Yeah, it's really sad, isn't it, that the video didn't work?
It is too bad, but your voice is so compelling that I think it didn't really matter. It's also an honor to host you right before the 60th anniversary of the Jane Goodall Institute. Many congratulations for your wonderful work. Let me also close by saying the Einstein Forum in 2021 is going to begin a new series which is tentatively called People, Things, and Animals. to try and think about the relationships, some of the things that we've discussed today, and we're proud to be able to have this as a kind of preview of some of the questions that our staff member Misha Gabovich is working out in organizing this series. But mostly thank you to Jane Goodall, thank you to Wendy Doniger, thank you to Sham Upaluri, and enjoy the rest of your day or night wherever it is that you're tuning in from.
Okay, and any of you who drink wine or whiskey, let's do a toast later on to each other.
Absolutely, Jane. A virtual toast to you.
To you.
5 minutes. Very good.
A virtual toast, nobody, this is, you have to actually put the thing to your lips and take a sip, otherwise.
I will take a whole glass.
Virtual whiskey, a virtual toast, but real whiskey.
Definitely.
Real wine or anything. It can be water or tea. It doesn't matter. You can toast in anything.
I am going to toast to you with a glass of red wine in about 4 minutes.
Okay. Well, I'll be raising a glass of whiskey in about 3 minutes.
Let's see who's faster.
Okay. All right.
Good night. Good night.
And I'm sorry to all the people listening that we had the hitch at the beginning, but hopefully it worked, sort of. And if you don't know what I look like, you've only got to Google Jane Goodall and you'll see far too many Jane Goodalls out there.
I'm not sure there could be too many Jane Goodalls out there, but thank you very much.
Okay. Well, good night, goodbye, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Bye.
Goodbye, Jane.